Hello everyone, Brim Sparkle here. Today I'm going to talk about the comparisons between the book and movie versions of Bones and All by author Camille DeAngelis. As a note, my channel is not meant to rehash what you can find on Wikipedia, but will be more opinion based. So this will not be a by the book overview of the novel or movie, and will heavily focus on my opinions on both versions. So without further ado, let's begin. But before we get into it, if you're new to my channel, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you. So one day I stumbled upon a Books-A-Million at my local mall, and after perusing through the manga section and booktuber section, I made my way into the young adult section, and the book Bones and All caught my eye. I didn't know much about prior to buying it, but I knew there was a movie coming out soon starring Timothée Chalamet, and I'd honestly be lying if I said that wasn't reason enough to pick up the book. I'm also a sucker for young adult fantasy novels, especially if there are movie adaptations coming out very soon, and I tend to get massive FOMO otherwise. I took the book home, and it took me about 4 days to get through. It's about 304 pages, so it's a fairly easy light read. The novel was marketed as a quote-unquote cannibal romance, but I would actually categorize it more as a quote-unquote cannibal coming-of-age / road trip horror romance. Before we get into the plot, I'd like to give a big spoiler warning for those that haven't read the book or watched the movie yet. There will definitely be spoilers. So overall, Bones and All centers around Maren, a 16-year-old living with her single mom, Janelle, and from the beginning, it's explained that her and her mom move quite frequently, about like once or twice every year. So it kind of foreshadows that she did not grow up in a very stable environment. And throughout the beginning chapters, Maren alludes to their moving around due to her doing the quote-unquote bad thing, which we later find out that Maren is a cannibal. When she was a baby, she ended up eating her own babysitter, and that kind of kick-started things off, I guess. Throughout the first few chapters, we end up going back in time to her and her pretty much meeting a couple of boys. The first one in summer camp, the second one during a work party with her mom, and both times the male character takes interest in Maren and end up wanting to get more intimate with her. But because she's a cannibal, it ends up working against her favor. She ends up eating them, and mom finds out, and they end up moving. And that's kind of what life has been like since she was young. So as for characters, Maren is the main character. She's a cannibal baby. She ate her babysitter, and because of that, her mom ends up being terrified of her. She grew up not having much love. I mean, the love is kind of there. The mom takes responsibility for her as her child, but you can kind of tell there's still kind of a rift between them. On her 16th birthday, her mom ends up abandoning her in her apartment. The mom later goes back to live with her grandparents. So Maren, looking at her birth certificate, finds out she has a father, and finds out the address for where her father lives. So she sets off on a road trip to meet up with her father and meets fellow cannibals along the way. The second character I'd like to cover is Lee. I would say he's more of a deuteragonist. He's a potential love interest for Maren. After reading the book, I think there is, I think he could be a potential love interest, but I honestly got more of a kinship, friendship, or younger sister, older brother relationship from them. He's also a fellow cannibal she meets when she gets abandoned by her ride while hitchhiking at a local Walmart. And upon meeting, you can already tell they have a strange connection. Lee is a bit rough around the edges. He kind of is more blunt. You can kind of tell he accepts his fate as a cannibal more so than Maren, who's still kind of trying to learn to navigate through her sickness. What we do know about Lee is that he grew up with a mom and little sister, the latter of which he's kind of protective of. His mom kind of slept around. He never got to know who his real father is. His mom had a slew of boyfriends growing up, was kind of that kind of mom, but he still maintains his morals, and he still maintains, a protective aura about him, with his sister, and you could see that he's quite protective of Marin as well, and he kind of rubs off on her and kind of takes her under his wing to kind of guide through this, this kind of sickness. The third character I'd like to cover is Sully. So Sully is somebody she ends up meeting before Lee. So Marin ends up meeting this kind old lady at a grocery store who invites her to stay at her home. I think her name is Miss Harmon. She invites Marin over, gives her food and a place to stay, a shelter. And after taking a nap, Miss Harmon ends up passing away in her sleep. Marin ends up encountering Sully feasting on poor Mrs. Harmon's body. And Sully is an older man, and he reveals himself to be another cannibal. Unlike Marin and Lee, he actually waits for them to die before feasting on their body. Sully ends up being more of a father figure and ends up earning Marin's trust throughout the chapters, but we'll get into his character later on in the story. The plot twist is that Marin and Lee end up road tripping to the address for her father in the birth certificate, and Marin ends up meeting her grandma on her father's side. And as it later finds out that Marin's father was not the grandmother's biological son. In fact, they end up finding out that Marin's father was adopted after the grandmother and grandfather ended up losing their biological son. And it created a lot of friction because Marin's father did not actually live up to their expectations for Tom. As it turns out, Sully is the father of Marin's father, making Sully Marin's biological grandfather. And Sully is a cannibal. Marin's father is a cannibal. Marin herself is a cannibal. So it kind of brings down the line of lineage. So in the end, Sully ends up finding Marin and Lee in a university. They end up staying there as a shelter. Lee ends up eating a college girl, and they end up inhabiting in her dorm room for a few weeks. And Sully comes in and ends up stalking Marin. To what reason Sully ends up wanting to murder Marin and eat her? As to why, I have really no idea. As it reveals, although he does wait until they're dead, it doesn't mean he doesn't kill them as well. So there is a showdown between Sully and Marin. Lee ends up coming in, and actually he ends up killing and eating Sully and saving Marin. So Marin and Lee have a moment afterwards where Lee actually strips down naked and gets in bed with Marin, and it kind of alludes to the fact that they end up having sex. But by the start of the next chapter, we find out that Marin ends up eating Lee and killing and eating Lee. So that kind of ends Lee's journey. Towards the end of the book, Marin ends up working at the university library. She finds a nearby apartment to kind of live her life. And towards the end, she kind of accepts her fate as a cannibal. She kind of is more accepting of who she is and kind of uses her quote unquote powers for good by luring these men towards their ultimate fate. She ends up eating men who want to take advantage of women, basically. So I'd like to share my own personal thoughts about the novel. I personally believe that cannibalism was an allegory for trauma, whether it be childhood trauma, PTSD, or abuse. We're all victims of our past trauma, and as shown in the novel, not everybody that lives with trauma is a monster, and those that don't have trauma may turn out to be monsters anyway. But in the end, I believe the book was trying to tell us that it's ultimately us that have to deal with our own trauma in the end. Whether it's not aliving ourselves or believing we can make good use of our own talents and paying it forward. But I believe it was trying to tell us that we should not let trauma define who we are. As an aside, I did like the relationship between Marin and Lee. I thought they treated each other right. One could argue that there was no happy romance in the book, but especially after Lee serving his purpose in protecting Marin now that Scully was gone. It's possible that he just couldn't live with the guilt or handle being a cannibal anymore. I believe that he found his love for Marin growing, but knowing that neither of them could live a normal life, he took a chance in sleeping with her despite knowing full well he was going to be eaten in the end. I don't think it was entirely a suicidal situation. I think he really did love Marin just enough to sacrifice himself in order to feel some sort of intimacy with her despite knowing what would happen in the end. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I would rate it a 5 out of 5 for the story, characters, and plot development. So I actually watched the movie recently, and I had some opinions about the movie that I wanted to share. The first is that I thought it was interesting that they chose to have her live with her dad instead of her mom. I honestly don't think this could have taken away or added anything to the movie, but it's also kind of weird that they would change it. The second is witnessing actual cannibalism on film. So Mrs. Harmon in the books was a kind old lady that offered Marin kindness and a place to stay. But Mrs. Harmon in the movie was actually an old lady that was on the brink of death when they broke into her house randomly. And in the movie, Marin actually joined Sully in eating Mrs. Harmon. In the books, although Marin is a cannibal herself, she always had some sense of morality in her that kind of kept her from eating everyone. So I kind of felt like the scene was mostly done out of shock factor. When I watched the movie, there were only 5 of us in the theater. Soon as the scene came up, I saw someone just get up and leave, and they never came back. The third is that I kind of thought the chemistry between the 2 main characters was off. I think both are really good actors. I think this is more of a directing issue. I'm not sure if this was done on purpose, but it felt like they were talking at each other instead of to each other, rather than expressing emotions. And throughout the film, I kind of felt that the Marin was a little too neutral and passive. She had one emotion throughout the entire movie, and it wasn't until she finally met her mom at the mental hospital that I finally saw her express anger and resentment. I felt like they wanted to shove Marin and Lee in our faces, and it didn't seem like we got enough of them bonding on screen rather than off screen. It also felt like they could have used subtitles on screen. Both the actors of Marin and Lee tended to mumble their lines a lot. I'm not sure if this was directed properly, to be honest. Next, there was a scene where they ended up making Lee bisexual. So in the book, the carnival worker was a female who asked Lee out on a date. But in the movie, that changed to a male worker. And before Lee actually killed him, there was a sex scene right before. But I honestly didn't see the point of them adding that unless it was simply done for shock value. The next is the plot twist, which was a lot different from the books. In the movie, Sully is just a random guy who has no familial relations with Marin. In the books, he's actually revealed to be Marin's biological grandfather. But in the film, instead, he's just depicted as someone with a mental disorder, highly obsessed with Marin due to both of them being cannibals. The next, towards the last 10 minutes of the film, Marin and Lee decide to settle down in an apartment. Sully ends up stalking Marin in her apartment and tries to kill her. Lee comes in just in time, and they both end up killing Sully. Later on, Marin finds out that Sully murdered Lee's sister, and during the scuffle with Sully, it's revealed that Lee was stabbed in the lung and starts to bleed out. And since they can't call for a police or ambulance, Lee tells Marin to eat him. And throughout that, dramatic music plays, and we end up going back to the scene that took place just before this, where they're out in the field happy together. For me, I kind of enjoyed the film, but it's definitely not without its vices. And if you're a book reader, I think you would enjoy this on the big screen despite it not being completely faithful to the books. But that's all I've got today. What did you think of the book to movie adaptation? Please comment down below. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you later.